You are very welcome to this Transatlantic Currents webinar on the U.S. role in bolstering European defense capabilities and possible changes under the Trump administration. My name is Maria Lindén, and I'm a research fellow at the Center on U.S. Politics and Power here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And I will shortly hand the virtual mic over to the people that you've actually come to listen to today. But before I do so, just a couple of practicalities regarding questions from the audience. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, but as you listen to the conversation, please feel free to type in questions and comments already as you listen, and do so using the chat function, please. I will later read your questions out loud and give our guest speaker an opportunity to answer some of them. And now to introduce our wonderful non-resident fellow who will be interviewing our actual guest today. Leo Michel is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He has had a decades-long career in U.S. government, where he served as a government distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, director for NATO policy, and director for non-nuclear arms control at the OSD and the Pentagon. And he has degrees from John Hopkins and Princeton University. And I would like to welcome both Leo and our guest speaker, Mr. James Hursch. And I will now hand it over to Leo to introduce our guest speaker. Leo, the floor is yours.
Kiitos, Maria. Hello from Washington, and thanks to Jim Hursch and our audience members for joining us today. It's no secret that transatlantic relations writ large are experiencing something of a stress test these days. And it's not realistic, really, to assume that transatlantic defense cooperation would be unaffected by the disruption, friction, and sometimes recriminations that have occurred since the change of administrations in the US. We'll discuss current challenges in a minute, but it's useful, I think, to recall that the US approach to European defense capabilities has proved adaptable in the past. It was 26 years ago this month that NATO heads of state and government, meeting here in Washington, launched the Defense Capabilities Initiative, which came to be known as DCI. The DCI focused on improving NATO capabilities to respond to so-called non-Article 5 threats, resulting from regional conflicts, ethnic strife, and other crises beyond alliance territory, since the probability of large-scale aggression against the alliance itself in the foreseeable future was believed to be very low. Under the DCI, the US and European and Canadian allies took steps to better identify their capability shortfalls and devise smart multinational solutions. Now, however, in retrospect, the DCI did not effectively address problems arising from different assessments of threats that existed among the allies, or in too many cases, I'm afraid, their historically low levels of defense investment. And these problems became increasingly evident over the next decade, as NATO undertook out-of-area operations in Kosovo and Serbia, Afghanistan, and Libya. And over time, US officials became more open about their concerns. Here's what then Defense Secretary Robert Gates said in a June 2011 speech in Brussels. And let me quote him. "The blunt reality is that there will be dwindling appetite and patience in the US Congress and in the American body politic writ large to expend increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are apparently unwilling to devote the necessary resources or make the necessary changes to be serious and capable partners in their own defense," unquote. And in a March 2016 interview, President Obama surprised many, particularly, I think, in Paris and London, with his complaints about European free riders, especially when he was reflecting on the Libyan intervention of 2011. Now, that said, Mr. Obama and Mr. Gates repeatedly emphasized the bedrock American commitment to NATO, and they never suggested that the US would condition its Article 5 commitments to collective defense to the level of defense spending by our allies. And in fact, in the wake of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and intervention in eastern Ukraine in 2014, the US, at Mr. Obama's direction, strengthened its force posture in Europe and shifted the focus of cooperation with our allies from expeditionary operations to territorial defense, and I would point out closer bilateral and NATO cooperation with very capable partners, Finland and Sweden. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the US increased its force presence in Europe from approximately 80,000 to about 105,000, mobilized transatlantic efforts to provide large amounts of existing military hardware to Ukraine, and to expand US and also help expand European capacity to produce new systems, both for NATO's deterrence and defense needs, as well as Ukraine's. I'm finished setting the stage, but the bottom line here is the transatlantic cooperation, while difficult and sometimes uneven, has proved possible in the past. Now, to help us understand current and potential future challenges, I'm pleased to welcome Jim Hursch. He is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Jim retired from the Defense Department just last summer. As a career nonpartisan senior executive, he served as director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency and director of the Defense Technology and Security Agency. And between those two very high-level posts, he worked for 8 years in senior positions at the US mission to NATO, including as the acting Secretary of Defense representative in Europe and the acting defense advisor. And I want to mention as well that earlier in his Pentagon career, Jim had extensive experience handling relations with Denmark. And indeed, he was seconded to the Danish Defense Ministry for about 3 years between 1999 and 2002. Among his many rewards during his government service, I'm sure that Jim is particularly proud to have received the Finnish Order of the Lion and the Swedish Order of the Polar Star. So Jim, perhaps the most visible manifestation of transatlantic cooperation on capabilities involves the transfer of American-produced weapon systems. Can you provide an overview of how US policy is set? What's the Pentagon role in overseeing weapons transfers? And could you speak briefly, to the role of Congress in these processes?
Right. So we have two essential systems for transferring articles and services, defense articles and services to foreign countries. One is the foreign military sales system, which runs government to government. State Department does the approval along with a congressional review period. This is a system in which the U.S. government actually provides the program management to countries so that they don't have to deal directly with the contractors. As a result, it's a somewhat bureaucratic system. The direct commercial sales system only requires from the US government an export license, although for large sales, that export license still requires congressional overview, and it requires a technology review in both cases. The technology review is one of the things that people have historically said is not very efficient in the US system. That's a fair characterization, but there are good reasons for doing the technology review. Congress, in both cases, for sales above certain dollar thresholds, does a formal review of a notification. And over time, because our congressional members don't like being surprised, they have agreed with our executive branch to have pre-notifications of one kind or another that last for 30 to 60 days, and where members of Congress can put a hold on a sale. So it can take a good long time. But once you have a deal with the US government, either through an export license for a direct commercial sale or through a case in the foreign military sales system, you have the entire US government supporting those transfers.
Okay. So Europe, as our audience knows, has been a very important destination for US weapon systems, especially in recent years in areas such as combat aircraft, helicopters, and air and missile defenses. Looking at government figures, the foreign military sales portfolio of our European allies reached $68 billion last year. And that's a 600% increase over the average during the years immediately preceding Russia's 2022 offensive. So there's been a big jump in foreign military sales. If you take into account the commercial sales of military equipment to Europe, that's roughly another $170 billion per year. And frankly, I'm not sure if those figures capture all of the US military assistance to Ukraine, which totals somewhere over $62 billion since early 2022. Looking at this a different way, I just wanted to point out that according to the Swedish think tank SIPRI, a total of 55%, that's 55% of European arms imports came from the US during the 2019 to 2023 period, and that is a 20% jump over the previous 4-year period of 2014 to 2018. So the sums here are enormous. So with my sincere apologies, Jim, I'm going to ask a couple of interrelated questions, and you can respond or reframe these however you like. First, during your years in the US government, was it your experience that Washington worried about the possible downsides of excessive European dependence on US weapon systems? One possible downside being Europe's underinvestment in its own defense industrial base? Or did the US government actually place some kind of priority on the benefits of having Europeans buy American? The second question is basically this: did the US government actively promote or actively discourage partnership arrangements between the US and European and Canadian defense companies, or was this left mainly to the companies, the transatlantic companies, to work out? And to your knowledge, has this changed given the experience and the demands of the war in Ukraine?
Okay, so I'll try to take those one at a time. The first is that I don't think the US government ever seriously worried about underinvestment in the European defense industrial base. It worried considerably about whether there was underinvestment by Europe in defense and the burden sharing questions associated with that. Your introduction gave a good resume of many of those statements, which have only become stronger in the last couple of administrations. What the US was most interested in was two things. One, the overall capability of the alliance and our partners. And secondly, the health or lack thereof, or the health of US defense industry. And so it was US policy to support an American-made product against any foreign-made product, whether it was European, allied or not, or anywhere else in the world, in a direct competition. And so the US government has an advocacy policy by which it will take all the tools of the US government to support a competition, say, against French or other aircraft. Gripen from Sweden was always a little strange because by some calculations, the Gripen is at least 60% American parts. So there was always sort of a controversy about the Gripen. I would say that this has changed in the last 4 years. The numbers you cited are record-setting in terms of our sales overseas. In 2024, we did $118 billion of sales through the foreign military sales system worldwide, which was almost a doubling of the previous year. And that 118 billion did not include the assistance that was given to Ukraine on a non-sales basis. So another 25 billion dollars, I think, in 24 of that kind of assistance. What we found as we went through the Ukraine crisis and our own needs as well as trying to figure out how to support a Taiwan contingency if one were ever to come, was that our U.S. defense industrial base was not big enough. It had not become flexible and robust enough to be able to support the requirements. So production timelines started to lengthen out to, in some cases, for European allies for major weapons systems, 5 years or more. That began to have the U.S. Department of Defense very interested in whether our allies were also producing sufficiently and in whether there were ways we could cooperate with allies to do so. And we have, in the last couple of years, set up several co-production agreements with allies, including Australia, Poland, the NATO alliance through the NATO Supply and Procurement Agency. And I would say before that, the major interest the U.S. government had in trying to get cooperation with our European allies was through cooperative research and development programs. So sort of at the early end of the science and technology and development of systems, where we worked hard with our Europeans in many cases to provide cooperative programs.
So at the outset, I did refer generally to some of the tensions that we're all aware. And some allies appear to be rethinking whether purchases of U.S. systems in fact serve to guarantee U.S. commitments to strong deterrence and collective defense in Europe. According to various reports I've seen, at least a few allies might, and I'll underscore might, be reviewing current cooperative programs, including their purchases of the F-35 combat aircraft, to reorient themselves to a more, let's call it, European-centric approach. You've no doubt noticed that the EU's recent white paper for European defense and its Rearm Europe plan clearly emphasized such an approach. And the president of the EU Commission herself put it this way last month. She said directly, the security architecture that we relied on can no longer be taken for granted. We must buy more European. The signals have not been ignored. We've seen credible media reports that senior US officials, to include the Secretary of State, have told European counterparts that any exclusion of US companies from European tenders would be seen negatively by Washington. We understand you're no longer in government, but I do want to ask your personal assessment of the risk versus benefit calculations by US stakeholders on one side and European and Canadian stakeholders on the other side of a potential downturn in cooperation with the US on future defense capabilities. What's at stake?
Yeah, as you said, I'm no longer in the US government, so these are my personal opinions. I think that the risk that Europeans are seeing of US not being willing to support or continue to support their programs that they've bought from the United States, it's a fair concern. I would hope the US government will never go there, that our alliance commitments will be sufficient. But in the last couple of months, we've seen a decided change in the rhetoric coming out of government. For the alliance as a whole, I think this is really bad news. I have long supported what I once heard a Danish senior official say, which is the important thing is to get the best value for the money and the most capability. If we end up in a world in which the European and American markets are entirely divorced from each other, neither one of us will get that value for money. There are certain things that the European industry currently just does not have the capability to produce. Some ISR, some air defense, or at least high-end air defense. I know France does have an air defense system, certainly, that's good. There are many, many cases where we've been able to actually work together. The Joint Strike Fighter, for example, is a huge multinational cooperative program which supports jobs in many, many European countries. It will not work as well if we have to differentiate the supply line so that there is no, so that we're not cooperating together. Another case is NASAMS, the air defense system that several of the Baltic countries are buying. and that we have used effectively along with Patriot in Ukraine. The launcher is made by Koningsberg in Norway. The thing that's launched, the missile, is an AMRAAM missile that's made in the US. We're not going to do as well if we have two separate systems. During my time at NATO, I very much argued that as the US set up its PESCO, program, that the US needed to be allowed to come in and participate so that we could get the best and the best cooperation rather than a pure competition where we're fighting against each other instead of working together.
Mm-hmm. So at this point, because we want to leave time for the audience questions, I want to broaden the conversation beyond arms sales and defense industry. There are so many other ways that US, Europe, and Canada work together for decades to improve capabilities and to put those to use. So in this context, I do want to note that General Chris Cavoli, who's commander of the US European Command, who's also dual-hatted as the NATO SACEUR, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee on April 3rd. We're going to post his opening statement on the chat function. He says a lot of very timely and interesting, important things about the Russian role in Ukraine, their strategy, and their ability to reconstitute forces. And he has some very important statements there on how he, as the commander of European Command, views the importance of the US presence in Europe and the important contributions of our allies. So we're going to post that in the chat function. Jim, here's your opportunity. I'd like you to look back at your 8 years in the US mission to NATO. What do you say? What's your message to Americans, Europeans, and Canadians who have heard officials near or at the highest level in Washington appear to question the value of the alliance, not only in public statements, but also in, as we know, internal discussions that they assumed would remain private? That's my last question.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to say is that I truly believe that the NATO alliance has been, to a large extent, what's preserved peace on the European continent and allowed the European Union to grow and prosper as well. It is that transatlantic link that is vital. When I think about this, I always go back to a speech that then Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg made in front of the US Congress, in which he said, essentially, it is good to have friends. Anybody who hasn't seen that speech and is looking for a reason to, in their own mind, justify the continuation of NATO ought to go look at that speech. I think Europeans need to know that the foreign policy and rhetoric that you referred to, Leo, is not the reason that Trump was elected. Trump was elected as president because there was a large portion of the American society that believed that what the inflation and the economic policies that the previous administration followed were not actually reaching them. And so they felt somewhat dispossessed. When you ask the American people, as several pollsters have, whether they believe NATO is a good thing, whether they believe supporting Ukraine is a good thing, you end up with majorities high above 60% in both cases. In the US Congress, there were a sufficient number of Republican and Democratic senators who have declared or passed a law that says that the president would have to come back to Congress and get at least a 2/3 majority vote in order to do a significant change to the way that the US is associated with NATO. I know that it's really hard when the first Trump administration went through and now we're back to President Trump to believe that this is a short-term thing that the US will get through. It may not be. But I think everybody has to believe that we're better together. When the US deploys overseas and looks to its left and looks to its right, it is NATO allies. No matter where we are in the world, it is NATO allies, along with our Australian friends, who are generally with us in those conflicts. The US and Europe are the two largest economic trading partners for each other. Our economies, as we've seen in just the last couple of days, do not do well when people worry that that economic intercourse is not going to continue. So I think we have to stick together. I think what that means, though, is that Europe does need to continue to increase its investment in its own defense. It perhaps needs to be able to take over some of the capabilities and missions that the US has historically done. And it needs to think carefully about how its own defense industrial base needs to be restructured. In the US, our defense industrial base became too concentrated after the end of the Cold War. And that's one of the reasons that we're not particularly capable of quick changes to deal with current issues. I believe in Europe, the defense industrial base is still probably too fractured along national lines, and it needs to come together in ways that will allow it to have economies of scale and increase production. Together, I think we can do better. I think there are rough times ahead. General Cavoli, elsewhere in his testimony, addressed questions about drawing down of US forces from Europe. That may happen to some extent, but as General Cavoli said, it's not a positive thing for the alliance, and it's not something we should easily acquiesce in. And if Europe, at the same time, can increase its defense capabilities, that will be really important.
Thank you. Back to you, Maria, and you can submit the questions that I'm sure are coming in from your audience.
Yes, I'm back. So yes, we have two questions from the audience. It says, thank you for your great insights. Lots of questions, but trying to limit myself. So there's two questions here. First of all, considering your experience regarding Denmark, are there any reflections you have on Trump administration policies and actions regarding Greenland, and also on what implications are for allied forms of cooperation, including NATO as an organization? And then a second question, having also worked with Finland, what thoughts do you have about Finnish industry specifically and how it should develop? And should Finland adopt an FMS, like government-to-government system?
All
So
right.
let's start with those.
Okay. So on Greenland, I could do an entirely another additional hour or two of conversation. I think the rhetoric of the current administration on Greenland and Denmark is absolutely deplorable. That's as partisan a statement as you're going to hear from me. There are, however, legitimate concerns about keeping adversary investment out of the Greenlandic economy, and particularly for the rare earths and minerals that are there. And there is a legitimate concern about, with the climate change, the maritime routes around Greenland. The answer is to work very, very closely with our Danish allies and the Greenlandic people to make sure that they are addressing those issues, not to annex additional territory. I think I answered the NATO question, part of that question. And on Finland, again, I am thrilled after almost 30 years of cooperation with Finns and Swedes that they are members of the alliance. It's unfortunate that it took Vladimir Putin to make that happen. A friend of mine always says it's not the US and it's not NATO that got Finland and Sweden into NATO. It is Vladimir Putin. We have him to thank for that. But it is wonderful to have two of the strongest militaries in Europe as part of the alliance. As far as Finnish defense industry, and I should say that the other thing I really like about Finland is that Finland really cares about making sure its population understands the continuing importance of defense. And having worked closely, knowing that a cadre of people is brought back every year to be able to see what's actually going on in Finland in defense when they're far into their careers is really important and a really good policy. As far as Finnish defense industry, Patria is the thing I am most aware of. I know that it produces really, really good vehicles and equipment. I think it will need to cooperate with others in the European defense industry in order to ensure that it has the market size it needs and to be able to provide the capability it needs. Whether Finland should itself have a foreign military sales system, most countries do not have a government-like government-to-government sales process. The government is often involved to promote and to approve sales, but not to actually do it. I think the question that Finland should be careful about is how do you actually do the process of sales and to whom do you sell? And I'm sure that knowing Finland, that that's already being taken care of in the Finnish government.
Thank you. We have another question now, or at least a comment. Oh, there's a comment and a question. So this commentator says that I agree entirely that Europe must invest more, also to be able to replace some strategic enablers only US has, partially to enable transfers of those to other theaters. With this in mind, do you think US should focus on European allies spending a certain percentage, 3% or 5% on defense, or focus more on strong arming European allies to procure and take in to use certain ISR, etc. capabilities?
So there's a whole bunch of questions entangled into that. I was actually on the ground at NATO in 2014 when we did the original defense investment pledge of 2%, negotiating with our allies all the way through that process. At the time, a lot of people said, shouldn't the US be more nuanced? Shouldn't we think about many other factors rather than just the gross percentage of GMP? And we decided that the answer was there's the need for a simplicity here, something that populations will understand and something that governments can easily track instead of getting very complicated. I still think that's a good idea. I do think we need to go above 2%. I think 3%, maybe 3.5 is within the range of the possible. I don't think that the US government strong arming as such the Europeans to buy particular systems is necessarily the right thing. Our job needs to be to make sure that wherever they spend their defense budgets, that it fills NATO defense capability targets and meets NATO defense needs. And if they choose to buy US, that's great. It's good for our industry. But if they choose to buy European, then that's all right too. The important thing is having interoperable capabilities in the end.
All right. We don't have any more questions from the audience. Please do type in your questions, but I have a couple of questions in mind as well. There are credible reports that Pentagon has considered stepping away from your US leadership of SACEUR. Would you care to share your thoughts on this rumor or these reports?
Yeah, I have no idea whether it's true or not. I have seen those reports too. I think that would be a horrendous action. And I think General Cavoli in his testimony sort of showed why that is. There is no other European country that currently has the capability to command or experience commanding and operating at the corps level or higher. The US needs to be present to assume that. Also, the US has an extremely long history of not allowing its troops to serve in combat when there isn't a US commander at the top of the command chain. I think that would be extremely difficult in a contingency to get around. And therefore, I think having a SACEUR, a US SACEUR, working together with a European or Canadian, it could be allied Secretary General is the right governance structure for NATO.
All right, and to add another question, it's been reported that Defense Secretary Hegseth is not planning on attending the April 11th meeting of NATO's Ukraine Assistance Support Group. Any thoughts on this?
Again, I really wish it weren't the case. I think that in any negotiations with the Russians about a ceasefire ending the war. The Ukrainians need to have a strong negotiating position, and not having American leadership or at a minimum participation in the Ukraine contact group meetings does not help in getting us to that point.
Thank you. Leo, would you like to ask a question? We still don't have new ones from the audience.
Sure. Is my mic on?
Yes.
Okay. Jim, we overlapped in the office of the Secretary of Defense for a number of years, which is where we met. But one of the things I did when I was heading up NATO policy in the Pentagon was I spent a lot of time then and subsequently as well on NATO-EU relations. During your time at the Pentagon or at the U.S. mission to NATO, I imagine it was probably one of your top 4 or 5 priorities. Could you say a little bit about how this has improved, where it's still inadequate, and in particular, don't restrict it to simply to Ukraine, but to the broader cooperation in the defense area? What would you like to see happen?
Yeah. So during the time I was at NATO, the U.S. mission to NATO, at least, and I think the U.S. government was generally fairly negative on the idea of the EU focusing too much on defense. The concern, which I think was a valid concern, is that with limited resources, the EU should not be doing things that duplicate or confuse what NATO is doing. And so there was a lot of concern when the EU was talking about establishing its own command structure, when the EU was talking about setting up battle groups, whether or not that was a duplication and a double use of requirements for limited resources. I think there's been a shift, especially in the last part of the Biden administration, on this issue, and a real beginning to understand that if the EU can instead be a facilitator for the increasing of European defense capability and the international cooperation among EU members that can increase EU capabilities or European capabilities, that's a good thing. And so I tend to agree with that, that having a European pillar in NATO is probably something that continues to be important and good. But that's different than a statement that says the EU should do the same things that NATO is doing in terms of actually building organizations and committing resources to things. So to the extent that the EU can guide European defense investment, can make it easier for European countries to spend good money on defense, perhaps, by looking at the debt limits and so on that have been going on here recently. That's all to the good. And the economic aspects of defense cooperation are things that I think the EU can participate in. Command structure is not so necessary. We have thought a lot about how NATO command structures or coalitions of the willing could do things that the EU might want to do that the US might not want to be involved in. So I think it's a good thing. When Europe started setting up the PESCO process for European coordination on defense projects, we were very nervous because we felt that it was important that the US at least have access to understanding what's going on in the meetings, and perhaps in some cases to suggest positive solutions to European problems that we might be able to cooperate with. We were finally able to break through on mobility questions, crossing borders and so on. And after I left, there was actually the ability to finally sign an association agreement for PESCO. All those things are good. I think, again, where we can come together and do things together, great. If the European Union can help Europe do better together, great. So I really have sort of shifted my own view on how important the EU can be on defense. It's just a question of where where it takes the time to apply itself.
Thank you. We have at least one more question from the audience, and please do keep typing them in. There's still a little bit of time left. The audience member says, this is a very specific question, but within the broader context of discussions about nuclear deterrence in general, and integrating it more closely in conventional defense planning in Finland as a new NATO member, and in Europe, thinking about the French and German statements, do you think there is a need for other users of F-35s, such as Norway, Finland, Poland, to consider, at least in theory, becoming dual-use capable, if only for distributed flight operations?
That's a tough one. The nuclear politics in the alliance are a whole nother suggestion or question. I think that probably the current nuclear posture of the alliance is probably about right. There have been, over the last several years, exercises which involve additional countries playing roles either as escort fighters or something like that. The more countries that have the capability to do dual use missions, probably the better in terms of resilience of the nuclear deterrence in the alliance. But I'm not suggesting that that means a whole-scale change in the nuclear posture of the alliance.
Thank you.
Phil may actually have views on that more than I do, but.
Well, we don't have any more questions from the audience, so I'm going to hand the floor back to Leo, and you can either elaborate on your views on this thought or ask our speaker one last question. Please, Leo.
I'll just be very brief on that last question. It is something new that attention is being paid to, and I've seen this in French think tanks, in German think tanks. There's been some discussion of this even among some German politicians. Germany is, as most of our participants know in the audience, NATO as a policy doesn't actually name, and I think this is overall for good reasons. NATO as a policy doesn't specify which countries participate in nuclear sharing, at least in the aspect of dual capable aircraft and the stationing of a relatively small, historically small number of US gravity bombs in Europe. But there are, in Germany, it's an exception. In Germany, the serving government officials have acknowledged the presence in Germany of, without talking numbers or locations, of US weapons that could be carried by dual capable German aircraft. But the question is whether or not other alternatives, somehow there's talk of extending somehow the French nuclear deterrent to cover the rest of Europe, possibly in cooperation with the British ones. There are all kinds of strategic, doctrinal, and political questions that would have to be solved. And I think, from an American's perspective, one also no longer in government, it's important to think of the various functions that the current nuclear arrangements solve. One of them is a very important one, is non-proliferation. So by having the US connection on nuclear weapons with NATO, it serves to dissuade or make unnecessary other European countries to think that, well, they somehow need to have their own independent nuclear deterrence. And that's traditionally been a concern, non-proliferation. And the other is, I don't want to say by simply discussing the topic, but it's not, it seems to me, in US and certainly not in European or Canadian interest to say or do things that would cast any doubt on the credibility of the US nuclear guarantee to Europe, which NATO has long recognized is the ultimate guarantee of alliance security, while recognizing the very important contribution of the independent French and UK deterrence as well. I would simply say the fact that the debate now that has been reopened and reopened with some new ideas, it's on the one hand, it's sensible. On the other hand, it's a little bit worrisome that underlying all of that is some kind of doubt among some European circles, at least in think tanks, that maybe the US is just not as reliable as we used to be. And I think that's a sad outcome. And we shouldn't pretend it's not there.
Yeah, I think I'd endorse all those statements, Leo.
So Jim, I wanted to thank you very much. As the audience members know, FIIA and through FIIA, I'm always available if you have follow-up questions. And I would certainly encourage you to take a look at that very, very interesting, comprehensive, thorough, and very, I would say, frank statement made by General Cavoli, who is at least scheduled to step down because this will be the end of his rotation, the normal rotation at NATO as the NATO SACEUR. But that's a decision to be made by many people above my pay grade in government during the summer. Thanks very much, Jim. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.